Nice bruises, Princess. Didn't know Fort Blackwater had spa days. The voice sliced through the early morning haze like a dull blade, cutting through the humid Tennessee air with deliberate cruelty. Private Jake Morrison smirked as he stepped back in line, his voice pitched just loud enough to ensure every soldier within 50 yards could hear his mockery. That was the point, after all. Public humiliation always hit harder than private insults, and Jake Morrison had built his reputation on knowing exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Sergeant Maya Stanley stood alone on the open training field, her olive-green tank top soaked through with sweat despite the early hour, dust clinging to her bronze skin like a second uniform that refused to come clean. The morning sun caught the evidence of her recent struggles. Bruises bloomed across her arms in shades of purple and yellow, spreading down her collarbone like twisted artwork painted in pain. These weren't the kind of marks that came from one bad day or a single accident. These were the kind you earned slowly, the kind that lingered and told stories their bearer never wanted to share, the kind that whispered of battles fought in darkness where no one else could see. Her knuckles were raw and split, the skin across them telling tales of recent violence, and her gait carried the slightest hitch, a barely perceptible favor of her left leg that spoke of old injuries never quite healed. But despite the physical evidence of whatever hell she'd been through, Maya's posture remained unshaken, her spine straight as a rifle barrel, her shoulders squared with the kind of discipline that couldn't be taught in basic training. Behind her, the assembled unit of Bravo Squad shifted restlessly. Some chuckled quietly at Jake's crude joke, while others watched her with the detached amusement of spectators at a blood sport, waiting to see if the new arrival would crumble under the pressure or fight back. She was new here, technically the only female soldier assigned to Bravo Squad in the last 2 years, a fact that had generated considerable speculation among the ranks. No formal introduction had been made, no backstory provided, no explanation given for her sudden appearance among their tight-knit brotherhood. All anyone knew was that she'd been transferred in on what the paperwork called a special directive, military bureaucracy speak that could mean anything from disciplinary action to witness protection. The ambiguity had bred whispers that floated through the barracks like smoke, each theory more creative than the last. Some claimed she was recovering from combat injuries, pointing to the obvious physical evidence. Others insisted she was just a paper pusher trying to prove herself with real soldiers. A few suggested she was an undercover investigator, but Maya Stanley offered no clarification, no defense against the speculation, no acknowledgement of the whispered theories that followed her like shadows. "How many push-ups does it take to snap a wrist, Sarge?" Jake continued his assault, his lazy grin spreading wider as he warmed to his theme. "Or did you trip over your own ego again? Maybe took a tumble down the stairs at the Pentagon?" The question hung in the air like poison gas, and the nervous laughter that followed had the sharp edge of pack animals testing their prey. Jake Morrison had always possessed a particular talent for finding the exact words that would cut deepest, and he'd learned early that public ridicule was far more devastating than private confrontation. Maya didn't say a word in response to his taunts. She didn't flinch when the laughter rippled through the assembled soldiers, didn't even blink when Jake's voice rose another octave to ensure maximum audience participation. Her dark eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the training field, as if she were seeing something the rest of them couldn't perceive. That absolute stillness, that complete lack of reaction, bothered Jake more than he would ever admit to his fellow soldiers. He'd expected anger, tears, or at least some defensive response that would validate his cruelty and provide entertainment for the crowd. None of them really knew her, and in the absence of truth, people inevitably became bold. They filled the vacuum of information with their own assumptions, their own prejudices, their own need to categorize and dismiss anything that challenged their understanding of how things should be. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that Maya Stanley hadn't asked to come back to active duty. She had volunteered for this assignment, not because she needed redemption or sought to prove anything to anyone, but because she carried debts that only she understood, responsibilities that weighed heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. From a small rise just beyond the training field's perimeter, General Victor Sterling stood watching the scene unfold with the patience of a man who had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by its cruelty. His weathered hands remained clasped behind his back, his expression as unreadable as carved stone, but his pale blue eyes missed nothing. He'd known the moment Maya stepped out of that dusty Humvee earlier that morning that this assignment wouldn't be easy for her. Maya Stanley had never sought attention or recognition, had never asked for special treatment or consideration, and yet, wherever she went, history seemed to follow like a faithful dog, impossible to shake and impossible to ignore. Still, the general didn't intervene in the ugly scene playing out below. Not yet. Sometimes the best lessons came from allowing situations to develop naturally, from letting people reveal their true character without interference from authority. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't force respect or manufacture character. Both had to be earned through fire and proven through adversity. Maya Stanley had already proven herself in ways these young soldiers couldn't begin to imagine, but they would have to discover that truth for themselves. Maya stood in the rising heat of the Tennessee morning, silent and still as a monument, while the bruises along her neck, half-healed but still angry red at the edges, caught the strengthening sunlight. The thin scar beneath her left eye shimmered faintly, a pale line so precise it looked almost surgical, a mystery that would have solved many puzzles if anyone had bothered to ask the right questions. She didn't defend herself against Jake's verbal assault, didn't look away from whatever distant vision held her attention, because Maya Stanley knew something the rest of them had never learned in their comfortable lives. Respect earned in silence lasted longer than applause earned through noise. She looked like someone who had walked through hell and emerged carrying others on her back. And some of the assembled soldiers were already placing silent bets on whether she'd made it back intact or was still trapped in whatever nightmare had carved those marks into her flesh. But Maya's stillness wasn't the paralysis of fear or the submission of defeat. It was something deeper, something older, something that came from places where noise meant death and silence meant survival. Her shoulders remained squared despite the weight of invisible burdens, her breathing steady despite the emotional assault, her hands steady despite whatever memories Jake's cruelty might have triggered. The number 27 tattooed in small, precise digits on her left wrist caught the morning light for just a moment, barely visible beneath the sleeve of her tank top, but there for anyone who knew how to look. It was the kind of detail that might have explained everything if anyone had possessed the courage to ask. But courage was in short supply that morning among the soldiers of Bravo Squad. They preferred their mysteries unsolved, their assumptions unchallenged, their comfortable prejudices undisturbed by inconvenient truths. Jake Morrison's frustration grew with each passing second of Maya's silence. He'd expected to break her composure, to provoke some reaction that would justify his cruelty and entertain his audience. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who seemed as immovable as granite, as unresponsive as the desert, as dangerous as still water. Something about her absolute calm made him feel exposed, vulnerable, like he was the one being judged rather than the one doing the judging. The next morning brought no relief from Jake Morrison's campaign of systematic humiliation. If anything, Maya's refusal to react to his initial assault had only inflamed his determination to break through her composure and find whatever weakness lay beneath that granite. Exterior. As the squad assembled for their morning exercises, Jake made his move with the calculated precision of a predator who had identified his prey's vulnerabilities. He carried a water bottle in his left hand, ostensibly for hydration during the upcoming training session, but his real intention became clear when he deliberately stumbled near Maya's position. "Oops, clumsy me," Jake announced with theatrical regret as the contents of his bottle splashed across Maya's gear, soaking her backpack and the spare uniform she'd laid out for inspection. "Guess I'm just as clumsy as you are, right, Princess?" His voice carried that particular blend of false innocence and genuine malice that bullies had perfected throughout human history. The water darkened the fabric of her spare clothes and turned the dust on her equipment into mud, creating a mess that would take considerable time and effort to clean. Several soldiers snickered at the obvious setup, appreciating the creativity of Jake's latest torment. Maya's response was absolute silence. She didn't curse, didn't protest, didn't acknowledge anything had happened. She simply moved her damaged gear aside with methodical precision. During exercises, Jake continued obstructing her movements while maintaining the pretense of accidental clumsiness. "Get a good angle of those battle scars, Princess," Jake muttered as he pulled out his smartphone, angling it to capture Maya's struggle with the obstacle course, while his deliberate interference made every task more difficult. "This is going to make great content for social media." His phone's camera focused on her face, trying to capture any sign of frustration or anger that he could later use to humiliate her further. The other soldiers watched this technological assault with varying degrees of discomfort, some laughing along with Jake's performance, while others began to shift uneasily at the escalating cruelty. But Maya Stanley's response continued to confound her tormentor. Her eyes showed something deeper than mere patience. They reflected the controlled discipline of someone who had learned to master their emotions under far more challenging circumstances than anything Jake Morrison could devise. During the physical exercises, she moved with a precision that spoke of extensive training, her form flawless despite Jake's constant interference. Other soldiers began to notice that her technique was superior to their own, that she performed every movement with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of intensive practice. When the morning session ended and the soldiers dispersed for their break, Maya retreated to her small quarters in the barracks. Alone in that sparse room, she stood before the mirror mounted on the wall, her reflection showing the full extent of the damage that recent events had inflicted on her body. She raised one hand to gently touch the thin scar beneath her left eye, that precise line that seemed almost surgical in its perfection. From the small table beside her bed, she picked up a set of dog tags that bore 26 names engraved in tiny, precise lettering, names that meant nothing to anyone else but carried the weight of worlds for Maya Stanley. She had volunteered for this assignment, not because she needed redemption or sought to prove anything to the world, but because she carried unfinished business that could only be resolved through service to others. The photograph on her table showed 26 young faces, all wearing military uniforms, all smiling with the confidence of youth and the certainty of purpose. They had trusted her once, followed her leadership, believed in her ability to bring them home safely. That trust had been betrayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But the weight of that failure remained carved into her soul, like those scars were carved into her flesh. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the barracks, whispered conversations were taking place that would have changed everything if Maya had been able to hear them. Two older soldiers, veterans of multiple deployments, who had seen enough of military life to recognize certain signs, spoke in hushed tones during their afternoon break. "Don't mess with her," Sergeant First Class Rodriguez warned his companion, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "You heard about the Ghost Line mission, right? That operation that went sideways about 4 years ago." "The only one who made it back," Staff Sergeant Williams replied, his own voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Command said she needed special attention, special handling, something about psychological evaluation and fitness for duty reviews." The two men exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge of classified information that couldn't be discussed openly but carried implications. That made both of them nervous. That name they whisper sometimes, Widow 27, Rodriguez continued. I heard it mentioned in meetings with the brass. Stories passed around like legends during night shifts. Jake Morrison's frustration continued to mount as his campaign of psychological warfare failed to produce the desired results. When people don't know the truth, they become bold, he muttered to his closest supporters, his voice carrying the bitter edge of someone whose assumptions about the world were being challenged. He tried increasingly desperate tactics to break through Maya's composure, his insults becoming more personal, his interference more obvious. Nice collection of scars, he taunted during one particularly intense training session. Each one tells a story or just proof you're clumsy. Maya's only response was a slight tightening of her jaw, a barely perceptible clenching of her hands behind her back. But even these minimal reactions were enough to fuel Jake's determination to find whatever psychological button would finally break through her defenses. He began to sense that there was more to Maya Stanley than the broken soldier he'd initially assumed her to be, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down from the confrontation he'd initiated. Instead, he doubled down on his cruelty, convinced that persistence would eventually reveal her weaknesses. The mystery surrounding Maya continued to deepen as more soldiers began to notice details that didn't fit their initial assumptions. A veteran instructor made a point of avoiding eye contact with her during training sessions, not because he didn't respect her, but because he respected her too much to risk the complications that recognition might bring. Maya's walk carried that slight unevenness that spoke of old injuries, but her movements during combat training were fluid and precise, suggesting someone with extensive experience in dangerous situations. The number 27 tattooed on her wrist became more noticeable as other soldiers began to pay closer attention to details they'd previously overlooked. Some began to wonder if those digits might have significance beyond mere personal preference, if they might represent something more meaningful than simple decoration. But Maya offered no explanations, no clarifications, no acknowledgement that she even noticed their increased scrutiny. Jake Morrison's campaign of harassment reached a crescendo as he began planning what he called the ultimate test, a public humiliation that would finally break through Maya's psychological defenses and expose whatever weakness lay beneath her composed exterior. Tomorrow, we find out what our war hero is really made of, he announced to his supporters, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. She's been hiding behind that silent act long enough. Time to see if there's actually anything underneath all that mysterious. He spent the evening preparing for what he envisioned as the final confrontation, setting up his phone for live streaming and recruiting other soldiers to serve as his audience. This is going to be epic content, he bragged, already imagining the viral fame that would come from publicly destroying Maya's reputation. Finally going to show everyone what happens when pretenders try to play with real soldiers. His confidence was absolute, his conviction unshakable, his blindness to the true nature of his target complete. That night, Maya sat alone in her quarters, holding the photograph of 26 faces that had haunted her dreams for 4 years. She traced each face with her finger, remembering names and voices and final moments that no one else would ever know. They deserved better than what they got, she whispered to the empty room, her voice carrying the weight of survivor's guilt that no amount of therapy or time could fully heal. The faces in the photograph seemed to watch her with understanding, with forgiveness, with the patient acceptance of those who had paid the ultimate price for causes greater than themselves. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths none of them were prepared to face. Jake Morrison's arrogance was about to collide with a reality that would shatter his assumptions about strength, about sacrifice, about the true meaning of service. Maya Stanley's silence was about to be broken by forces beyond her control, and the revelation would transform not just her relationship with Bravo's squad, but their understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. The morning sun climbed higher over Fort Blackwater as Jake Morrison orchestrated what he confidently expected to be Maya Stanley's final humiliation. He had spent the previous evening recruiting an audience, positioning his supporters strategically around the training field, and setting up multiple smartphones to capture every moment of what he anticipated would be Maya's psychological breakdown. "Let's see if our princess can handle real military training," he announced, loudly enough for the entire assembled unit to hear, his voice carrying the theatrical confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages in the coming confrontation. Jake had arranged what he called a fitness challenge, a series of demanding physical exercises designed to push Maya beyond her limits while providing maximum entertainment for his audience. His phones were already recording, capturing every angle of what he expected to be a viral moment of military humiliation. "Come on, Sarge," he called out with mock encouragement, his voice dripping with barely concealed malice. "Show us what those scars taught you. Bet you've got some inspiring stories about how you earned each one." The assembled soldiers watched with varying degrees of comfort, some laughing along with Jake's performance, while others began to feel genuinely uncomfortable with the escalating cruelty. Maya Stanley stood at the center of this orchestrated harassment like a statue carved from granite, her posture unchanged despite the psychological assault being waged against her. She had faced far worse than Jake Morrison's adolescent cruelty, had endured trials that would have broken most people, and his amateur attempts at intimidation barely registered on her consciousness. Her dark eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the training field, as if she were seeing something that existed in a different time and place. Something that made Jake's pathetic display of dominance seem as insignificant as a child's tantrum. "Or maybe they're just from falling off your high horse," Jake continued, his voice growing more aggressive as Maya's lack of response frustrated his need for emotional validation. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just another broken soldier pretending to be tough." He gestured mockingly at her scars, pointing to the evidence of whatever battles she'd fought, as if they were proof of weakness rather than survival. "These look like you lost more fights than you won, princess. Maybe it's time to admit you don't belong here with real soldiers." The mockery reached its peak when Jake decided to reference the whispered name that had been circulating through certain military circles. "That's what some people call you, right? Widow 27. His voice carried the dismissive tone of someone who had heard rumors but understood nothing about their significance. "Sounds made up to me, like some comic book character. What's next? You going to tell us you're a superhero? Maybe you've got some secret powers hidden under all that damaged goods packaging?" The laughter that followed his joke was nervous and uncertain, as if some of the soldiers were beginning to sense that they were witnessing something more dangerous than simple hazing. For the first time since her arrival at Fort Blackwater, Maya Stanley showed a crack in her composure. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the effort of containing emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. Her jaw clenched with visible tension, and something flickered behind her dark eyes that made even Jake's most enthusiastic supporters take an involuntary step backward. It was the first sign that there might be fire beneath that granite exterior, that the silent woman they had been tormenting might possess depths of strength and fury that none of them had imagined. The atmosphere on the training field began to shift, as if a storm front were moving in from the distant mountains. General Victor Sterling stepped forward from his observation point, his weathered combat boots meeting the hard-packed earth with a slow, measured rhythm that seemed to echo across the suddenly quiet field. His arms were no longer clasped behind his back in the relaxed posture of a casual observer. They now hung at his sides, his hands formed into loose fists that spoke of barely contained tension. Every soldier present recognized the signs of a superior officer who had moved beyond mere displeasure into something far more dangerous. "You just ran your mouth at Widow 27. Sterling's voice carried across the field like a warning wrapped in gravel. Each word precisely enunciated and heavy with implications that made the assembled soldiers exchange nervous glances. Jake Morrison's confident smirk faltered for the first time, his expression shifting from arrogant amusement to confused uncertainty. "Widow, what?" he responded, his voice carrying a note of defensive irritation that suggested he was beginning to realize that his carefully orchestrated humiliation might not be proceeding according to plan. Sterling's pale blue eyes fixed on Jake with the intensity of a laser sight, his voice dropping to a level that was somehow more threatening than any shout could have been. "You don't need to understand what it means, but you'd better damn well remember it." The general's presence seemed to expand to fill the entire training field, his authority as tangible as the morning heat that was beginning to build around them. Behind Maya, one of the older instructors slowly came to attention. Not because military protocol demanded it, but because something deep in his military soul recognized that he was in the presence of someone who had earned such respect through blood and sacrifice. Callsign, Widow 27. Sterling's words fell into the morning air like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition and understanding through the assembled soldiers. Everything stopped at that moment. The nervous laughter, the mocking glances, the cruel smirks that had characterized Jake's campaign of harassment. Even the morning breeze seemed to pause, as if the natural world itself was holding its breath in recognition of the significance of what had just been revealed. The field didn't just go quiet, it became tense. With the kind of electricity that preceded lightning strikes, every soldier standing there felt as if they had just been roped into something far larger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The name Widow 27 began to trigger half-remembered conversations. Fragments of stories passed around during late-night guard duties, whispered rumors about military operations that had gone horribly wrong and the people who had somehow survived them. Jake Morrison's face underwent a transformation that was almost comical in its completeness. His expression shifted from confused irritation to dawning understanding to something approaching genuine horror as the implications of Sterling's words began to penetrate his consciousness. "No way," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own racing heartbeat. That's her." The phone in his hand slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the ground and automatically stopping its recording as the device's screen cracked against the hard-packed earth. A younger soldier let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, whispering, "No way," across the silent field. Another recruit's eyes widened with recognition, connecting puzzle pieces scattered across months of rumors. They had heard Widow 27 mentioned in meetings, stories passed around like legends during night shifts. A woman who went dark on communications for 5 days, only to re-emerge dragging bleeding squad mates through enemy fire. One soldier whispered to another, his voice carrying the hushed tones reserved for discussing the supernatural. But that was supposed to be a legend, an exaggeration. It wasn't supposed to be this woman, this bruised, silent figure standing in front of us, with dust in her hair and blood still crusted on her collar. The disconnect between the myth and the reality was almost impossible to process, like discovering that a character from a war movie was actually standing in their midst. Widow 27 wasn't just a soldier. She was a legend, a name whispered when talking about the worst deployment nightmares that could befall a military unit. She represented the kind of courage and sacrifice that most soldiers only read about in after-action reports, the kind of heroism that seemed too extraordinary to be real. But here she was, standing before them in flesh and blood, her scars telling stories that none of them had been wise enough to read correctly. Sterling stopped just a few feet from Jake Morrison, looking him over with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. "You don't need to understand what it means," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "But you'd better damn well remember it." Welcome to the first chapter of Military Shadows, where the truth behind a soldier's silence reveals the weight of sacrifice and the cost of courage. Behind Maya, the older instructor maintained his position of attention, his military bearing serving as a visible reminder that some forms of respect couldn't be commanded. They had to be earned through actions that transcended normal human experience. For the first time since her arrival at Fort Blackwater, Maya Stanley was no longer standing alone. The shift in the formation was subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that rippled through the assembled soldiers like a wave transforming their understanding of who she was and what she represented. The silence that surrounded her was no longer the uncomfortable quiet of social isolation, but the reverent hush that accompanied the presence of someone who'd walked through hell and somehow found the strength to return. Jake Morrison's world had just been turned upside down by the revelation that his target was not a broken soldier, seeking to prove herself, but a military legend whose reputation had been earned through sacrifice and heroism that he couldn't begin to comprehend. His carefully orchestrated campaign of humiliation had not only failed, it had exposed him as someone who attacked heroes without understanding what heroism actually meant. The phones he had positioned to capture Maya's humiliation now bore witness to his own ignorance and cruelty, creating a permanent record of his spectacular failure to understand the true nature of strength and service. The morning sun climbed higher over Fort Blackwater as the assembled soldiers began to grasp the magnitude of what they had witnessed. General Sterling's next words would reveal the full scope of Maya Stanley's story, the true meaning of her scars, and the reason why the name Widow 27 was spoken with such reverence in certain military circles. What horror did Mia survive that earned her the name Widow 27 type ghost? If you think Operation Ghostline was a massacre, General Victor Sterling's weathered face carried the weight of memories that most people would spend a lifetime trying to forget. His pale blue eyes swept across the assembled soldiers of Bravo Squad, taking in their confused expressions and dawning awareness that they had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding. "Have you ever heard of Operation Ghostline?" he asked, his voice carrying the deceptive calm that preceded revelations capable of changing everything. The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, and Jake Morrison's remaining confidence began to crumble as he realized that his carefully orchestrated humiliation had awakened forces he couldn't control. 4 years ago, Sterling continued his voice, maintaining that dangerous calm that made every soldier present lean forward despite their desire to retreat. A 7-person team was sent on a mission in enemy territory. Cold, dangerous mountain terrain where the temperature dropped below freezing, even in summer, where the wind could cut through military-grade gear like it was tissue paper. They were sent to check on a weapons location that our intelligence suggested was being used to supply insurgent forces throughout the region. The general paused, not for dramatic effect, but because saying these words still extracted a price from him that most people would never understand. What should have taken 2 days turned into 8 days of hell. Sterling's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of certainty that came from reading classified reports and debriefing the sole survivor of a military disaster, not because of equipment failure or communication breakdowns, but because sometimes the enemy is smarter than our intelligence reports suggest, and sometimes good soldiers walk into situations that no amount of training can prepare them for. A few of the younger recruits shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand that they were about to hear a story that would challenge their assumptions about military service and the true cost of serving their country. The general's gaze found Maya Stanley, who stood motionless at the center of the formation, her face carrying the blank expression of someone who had learned to disconnect from memories too painful to process while conscious. They were ambushed on day 2. Sterling continued, his voice growing harder with each word. 2 soldiers gone instantly, killed before they even knew they were under attack. professional marksmen using military equipment positioned perfectly to turn what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission into a killing field. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dust and heat across the training field, but none of the assembled soldiers moved or spoke. One more soldier bled out before sunrise. Sterling's recitation continued with the mechanical precision of someone reading from an official report, though everyone present understood that the emotional weight behind these words was anything but mechanical. Took a round through the femoral artery and couldn't be stabilized with the medical supplies they were carrying. Died calling for his mother while his teammates tried everything they knew to save him. The general's pause allowed the implications of that loss to settle over the assembled soldiers, driving home the reality that military service sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice from people barely old enough to vote. One soldier simply vanished during the firefight, never recovered, never found, never accounted for, maybe captured, maybe killed, maybe lost in terrain so dangerous that his body will never be found. His family still doesn't know what happened to their son. Sterling's voice carried the weight of countless similar stories, the accumulated grief of a career spent sending young people into harm's way and sometimes failing to bring them home. That left 3 soldiers cut off from support, surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain better than they did, facing 8 days of survival in conditions that would challenge experienced mountaineers. The general's eyes returned to Maya, whose composure remained intact despite the emotional minefield he was navigating. One soldier had metal pieces stuck deep in his chest from an improvised explosive device, shrapnel that made every breath a struggle, every movement a risk of internal bleeding. He could barely walk, couldn't carry his own equipment, and required constant medical attention just to stay conscious. Another soldier, their radio operator, was knocked unconscious by the blast and remained in and out of consciousness for days, unable to communicate with base or coordinate rescue efforts. And Maya Stanley, Sterling's voice carried a new note of respect as he spoke her name, was shot through the leg during the initial ambush. 2 broken ribs from the explosion. No medical supplies beyond basic first aid. No pain medication stronger than what you'd find in a civilian medicine cabinet. Just 12 miles of frozen hell between her and the possibility of getting her teammates to safety. The general's description painted a picture of suffering that most of the assembled soldiers couldn't imagine enduring, let alone overcoming. She carried the radio operator on her back. Sterling continued his voice, carrying the reverence reserved for describing acts of heroism that transcended normal human capability. Dragged the wounded soldier on a makeshift stretcher that she constructed from broken backpack straps and whatever materials she could salvage from their destroyed equipment. No help coming, no air support possible due to weather conditions, just pure determination and the kind of will that separates heroes from ordinary people. The assembled soldiers began to understand that they were hearing about someone who had redefined the limits of human endurance and courage. Mia's mind had drifted back to those 8 days of hell, to a place where there was no formation, no lines of soldiers, no Jake Morrison running his mouth about things he couldn't understand. In her memory, there was only blood in the snow, only the sound of her own breath getting weaker with each passing hour, only the weight of 2 dying men whose survival depended entirely on her ability to keep moving when every instinct screamed for her to stop. She could still hear the voice of the radio operator, barely conscious, but somehow finding the strength to whisper, "If I pass out, don't stop, just keep walking." She did exactly that. Sterling's voice cut through Mia's memories like a blade, bringing her back to the present moment where she stood surrounded by soldiers who were finally beginning to understand who she really was. Even when she could barely see through exhaustion and pain. Even when she had to crawl the last 300 wallers with both men on her back because standing was no longer physically possible. She brought them home because that's what real soldiers do. They don't leave people behind no matter the cost to themselves. The general's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as head dressed the assembled soldiers. "You think she came back to Fort Blackwater for fame? For recognition? For some kind of glory that would make her suffering worthwhile?" His questions were rhetorical, but they forced every soldier present to confront their own assumptions about heroism and service. She came back because she remembers what happens when soldiers aren't properly trained, when they're not prepared for the reality of combat, when they think military service is some kind of game or adventure. So, she volunteered to come back. Sterling's voice carried a note of amazement that someone who had endured such trauma would choose to return to military service. She asked for the hardest job we have, training instructor for new recruits who think they understand what it means to be a soldier. That means all of you. The general's words hit the assembled soldiers like physical blows, forcing them to confront the reality that their behavior toward Maya had not just been cruel, but profoundly disrespectful to someone who had earned the right to their respect through sacrifices they couldn't imagine. Every soldier standing in that formation now realized that Maya Stanley wasn't some broken warrior trying to hang on to past glory. She was a leader who had chosen to return to service in order to teach the next generation what real strength looked like. She hadn't come back with stories and speeches, but with scars that told truths about courage and sacrifice that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training manuals. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the disciplined strength of someone who had learned that actions spoke louder than words, that real heroes didn't need to announce their credentials. Jake Morrison's face had gone through a complete transformation during Sterling's recitation, shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching genuine horror. As the implications of his behavior became clear, even the boldest among them looked away. Sterling observed his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, not in fear, not in guilt, but in something far more rare on a training field. Respect for someone who had earned it through blood and sacrifice rather than demanding it through rank or position. And the assembled soldiers now understood that they had been in the presence of military legend without recognizing her, that their cruel laughter and casual dismissal had been directed at someone whose courage and sacrifice had redefined the meaning of military service. Maya Stanley was number 27, the survivor who carried the names and faces of 26 fallen comrades. The woman who had proven that real strength came not from dominating others, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything for the people under your command. Sometimes leadership doesn't come wrapped in medals, Sterling concluded. Sometimes it looks like a woman with bruised arms, a tight jaw, and fire in her silence. Someone who chose to come back when she could have walked away. The general's words would echo in every soldier's mind, forcing them to reconsider everything they knew about strength and heroism. But will Jake pay the ultimate price for his cruelty? BD Stories reveals the shocking consequences next. Type justice if you think Jake deserves what's coming. The aftermath of General Sterling's revelation settled over Fort Blackwater like dust after an explosion, leaving everyone changed by what they had witnessed. Jake Morrison walked off the training field with his head hung low, his shoulders curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller, his earlier swagger completely absent. The silence that followed him was more devastating than any shouted condemnation could have been. It was the quiet of people who had witnessed something that fundamentally altered their understanding of honor and disgrace. No one clapped for his departure. No one sneered at his retreat. And that absence of reaction was somehow louder than any noise could have been. Within hours, Jake's humiliation became complete. As the consequences of his actions spread through the military community with the speed of wildfire, his phone, which had been intended to capture Mia's breakdown for social media fame, instead contained a permanent record of his own spectacular failure to understand the true nature of strength and service. Other soldiers who had witnessed his cruelty began to distance themselves from him, recognizing that association with someone who had attacked a military legend would permanently damage their own reputations. The videos he had planned to use for viral fame became evidence of his profound ignorance and cruelty. Jake's exile from the military community was swift and absolute. His requests for transfers were expedited with unusual efficiency, and within days he found himself reassigned to a remote post where his reputation had not yet preceded him. But even there, the story of his confrontation with Widow 27 followed him like a shadow, whispered in conversations that stopped when he entered rooms referenced in evaluations that would ensure his military career remained permanently stunted. No one said goodbye when he left Fort Blackwater, and his absence was noted only by the improvement in the training environment that his departure created. Maya Stanley's response to Jake's downfall was characteristically professional and restrained. She didn't gloat over his humiliation, didn't seek additional punishment for his behavior, didn't even acknowledge that anything significant had happened. Instead, she continued her training duties with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout his campaign of harassment. Her silence and victory was somehow more powerful than any vengeful speech could have been demonstrating. The kind of grace under pressure that separated true leaders from those who merely commanded through fear or intimidation. The atmosphere at Fort Blackwater underwent a complete transformation in the days following Sterling's revelation. Soldiers who had previously ignored Maya or participated in Jake's mockery now found themselves paying attention to her every movement, studying her technique and listening carefully to her rare instructions. They began to understand that they were in the presence of someone who had redefined the limits of human endurance and courage, someone whose quiet professionalism masked depths of experience that most of them would never approach. Training sessions that had once been characterized by casual joking and relaxed attitudes became focused and intense as soldiers recognized that they were being instructed by someone who had earned her knowledge through trials that most people wouldn't survive. Maya's demonstrations of combat techniques carried the weight of a real-world experience. Her corrections of their mistakes came from an understanding of what happened when training failed in actual combat situations. The bruises and scars they had once mocked became visible reminders of the price of service and the reality of military life. Later that evening, the mess hall at Fort Blackwater buzzed with its usual quiet rhythm of conversation and clinking silverware. But something fundamental had shifted in the social dynamics of the facility. The conversations were more subdued, more respectful, as if the soldiers were finally beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about military life had been shattered by the revelation of who Maya Stanley really was. Nobody laughed too loudly or filled the air with meaningless chatter because they now knew that real heroes walked among them, and such presence demanded a different kind of respect. In the back corner of the mess hall, at a table designed for 6 people, Maya Stanley sat alone. As she had every evening since her arrival at Fort Blackwater, her posture remained unchanged, straight-backed, and alert. Her movements methodical and economical as she ate her meal in silence. She appeared to be someone who had never expected company and had learned not to need it. But something subtle had changed in the atmosphere around her. The isolation that had once seemed like rejection now felt more like the respectful distance that people maintained around someone whose sacrifices had earned them a different kind of recognition. The transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly. As individual soldiers made the decision to approach Ma's table, there was no fanfare, no dramatic speeches, no formal acknowledgement of what had transpired on the training field. Instead, there were just quiet footsteps on the mess hall floor, the soft sound of trays being placed on tables, the gentle scrape of chairs being pulled out. A younger recruit sat down first, his movements careful and respectful, followed by another soldier, and then 2 more. None of them spoke as they joined Maya at her table. They didn't offer apologies for their previous behavior, didn't try to explain or justify their earlier dismissal of her worth. Instead, they simply sat down and began eating their meals in companionable silence, their eyes occasionally glancing toward Maya with something that was neither pity nor guilt, but recognition. They had finally begun to see her not as the bruised and silent figure they had initially dismissed, but as the woman who had refused to break, even when she had every excuse to surrender. The soldiers now understood that they were in the presence of someone who had earned her reputation through actions rather than words, someone who had proven her worth through sacrifice rather than self-promotion. Maya Stanley was a soldier who didn't need to brag about her combat experiences, didn't demand special treatment based on her heroic actions, and didn't require praise or recognition to validate her service. She had earned her place through the kind of quiet competence that spoke louder than any medal or commendation could. As the evening progressed, one of the newer recruits leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked the question that had been haunting all of them. Why, Widow 27? The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of genuine curiosity rather than mockery or disrespect. Maya didn't look up from her meal, didn't change her expression, didn't pause in her methodical consumption of her dinner. "Because I've buried 26 of my team," she replied, her voice carrying the even tone of someone stating a simple fact. "I'm number 27. The words fell into the silence around the table like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that would continue to spread long after the conversation ended. The table went completely still, every soldier present recognizing that they had just heard something that would change their understanding of service and sacrifice forever. No one asked a second question, no one sought additional details, and no one tried to probe deeper into Mia's experiences. The silence that followed her words wasn't uncomfortable or awkward. It was reverent, the kind of quiet that accompanied the presence of something sacred. Every soldier at that table understood that they would never forget what those words meant, that they had been privileged to hear a truth that most people would never encounter. That night, no one made speeches about heroism or sacrifice. No one told Maya thank you or tried to express gratitude for her service. But they didn't need to use words to communicate their respect and understanding. They had shown up at their table. They had stayed despite the emotional weight of her revelation. And they had listened to her truth without judgment or expectation. For the first time since she had returned to Fort Blackwater, Maya Stanley didn't eat alone. What would you do if you discovered your biggest bully was actually a war hero-type respect? If this story changed how you see people with scars, the story of Maya Stanley and Jake Morrison spread through military circles like ripples in a pond, becoming a cautionary tale about the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance or circumstances. Maya continued her work as a training instructor, her quiet professionalism and hard-earned wisdom helping to shape a new generation of soldiers who understood that true strength came not from dominating others, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything for the people under your command. Jake Morrison's military career never recovered from his encounter with Widow 27. His story became a reminder that in the military, as in life, respect must be earned through actions rather than demanded through position or attitude. The videos he had intended to use for viral fame became evidence of his profound failure to understand the true nature of heroism and service. But perhaps the most important lesson from that morning at Fort Blackwater was about the power of silence and the strength that comes from enduring rather than retaliating. Maya Stanley had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is not anger or revenge, but the quiet dignity of someone who knows their own worth and doesn't need validation from others to prove it. Her scars, which had once been targets for mockery, became symbols of courage and sacrifice that inspired everyone who encountered her story. And in a world that often celebrates noise and aggression, Maya Stanley stood as a testament to the truth that real strength bleeds in silence, trains without praise, and stares down cowards until they remember what the word respect actually means. The 26 names on her dog tags would never be forgotten, and Maya Stanley, number 27, the survivor, the one who carried their memory forward, would continue to honor their sacrifice by teaching others what it truly meant to serve with honor, courage, and unwavering dedication to something greater than themselves. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button. It helps us share more incredible tales of hidden heroes. And if you'd like to support our mission of bringing these powerful stories to light, there's a link in the description. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people reveal extraordinary courage. Still here? You're one of us now. Subscribe to Bay Stories, and binge like your group chat depends on